Hey folks, to all of those that commented on my community page post about the loss of my father, I want to thank you, a very heartfelt thank you. It was a pretty tough day, and I've been thinking a lot about what I would say when my dad passed, because we knew it was coming. My dad suffered from prostate cancer for about 23 years. And in the last year, things progressed pretty negatively to where all of the treatments weren't working. And in late August, we were told that he had about 2 to 3 months to live. Now, he's pretty tough, and he managed to make it a little more than 2 or 3 months. But unfortunately, the cancer did win. I want to talk a little bit about my father because, honestly, I don't think I'd have this YouTube channel, and I wouldn't be here to tell you all the crazy things I've done out at my cabin if it weren't for my dad. Now, my childhood wasn't the greatest, and my dad was, as I said recently to someone, a very troubled man. He refused to acknowledge his real father. His real dad's name was Stanley Joe Manley. And he only really talked about his adopted father, Dale McVay, as his father. And those things happen in life. We all know that. But I will tell you this. When my dad was young, there definitely seemed to be a lot of anger and a lot of trouble in his life. That made him kind of a tough dad to have. So it was a bit of a rough childhood. He was very troubled. And, you know, he was fighting to find his place in the world. And my dad and I did not have a good relationship, actually, until I was in my 30s. It was kind of off and on, and I do have a lot of fond memories when I was a child, so don't get me wrong. But there was definitely a lot of memories that weren't quite as fond. But I will tell you this, my dad actually was a brilliant man. That may have contributed to some of his trouble, too. He came from a family that, well, they had some wealth, but my dad eschewed that and said, no, don't want it, and walked away from it. And I got to give him credit for that, because life is more important than that. He wanted to make his own way in the world. Although, I got to admit, it kind of would have been nice to have some of that when I was growing up. My dad was passionate about racing. He started racing an MGTD. I think it had like 36 horsepower or something when he was a teenager. He worked hard to get the money to buy that car and then used to blow it up constantly and rebuild it in the backyard. He actually crashed his first car when he was 15, about 2 weeks before getting a driver's license. So what I can tell you about that story is his dad had a Chevy, I don't know, it was probably like a 57 Chevy or 56, 55, something like that. My dad was, well, he would have been 15, so it would have been probably a 54 or 55 Chevy. And I guess my dad decided to take it out for a joyride and crashed it. And then decided to run away from home and thought he could be an Elvis impersonator. He couldn't sing very well, so I don't know why he ever thought that. Plus, at 6'3.5" or almost 6'4", I'm not sure how he thought he could, pretend to be Elvis and people would believe him. But that's what he did, and he caught a bus and he went north, and some sheriff picked him up somewhere and called his dad and sent him back. And at some point, he bought his MGTD and proceeded to basically blow it up regularly and give the California Highway Patrol a heck of a time. He used to love to run a road out of San Jose up into the Santa Cruz Mountains. I want to say it was called Bear Springs. Really twisty, windy road. I drove it once when I was in my 20s, and it was a fun little road. But he was big into racing. He ended up with a 3/4 race Austin Healey Sprite. I think it had a Sebring nose on it, or maybe it was the Bug Eye and his brother had the Sebring. But anyway, they were out running autocrosses and rallies and all kinds of stuff. And he actually got a factory drive in a Datsun 240Z at one point, though he got fired from that drive, which honestly didn't surprise me about my dad. He got into an argument with his co-driver, and instead of going left when the co-driver told him to, he went right and drove into an orchard at 100 miles an hour and got fired. But in '67, he and my mom decided to move up to Canada. I was 2. And we moved to Vanderhoof, British Columbia, to homestead a piece of land. Now, I always thought that was my dad's idea, and it wasn't actually until a few years ago that I learned it was actually my mom's idea. And that made a lot of sense to me, because my dad was never the mountain man type. He wasn't a guy that you would expect to go out and go hunting and fishing, and even though he did those things as a kid, it wasn't his thing. He was more a geek and a wannabe hippie and all these other things. So building cabins and being in the woods was not something that he was frankly good at, let alone really truly interested in. In fact, when we were in Vanderhoof, he had bought a 1967 MGB GT, which, by the way, became our family car. So we had a family of 6. I have 3 sisters. So the 3 sisters and our red bone hound and my dad and mom would actually go places in an MGB GT. Now, it's a sports car. The MGB has the drop top and the GT has a hatchback. So I remember riding in the hatchback with the dog, with the loose latch rattling as we go down a dirt road at 100 miles an hour, thinking I'm going to die at some point. But that was just kind of life, you know. We lived. My parents sort of thought they were hippies, but they really weren't, which is kind of funny too. I think they wanted to be hippies at one point or another. My dad, the Marine, now trying to be a hippie, and at one point he had actually wanted to be a Jesuit, you know, priest too. So I think, you know, he was a conflicted man. At times he was very conservative. At times he was very liberal. Sometimes he wanted to be a Jesuit priest, and other times he wanted to be a hippie. And then he would say he was somewhere right of Genghis Khan. But in any case, we moved all over British Columbia. And by the time 1974 rolls around, he was building that same MG into a race car. And to give you a little idea into who my dad was, he decided to name his racing team, which was really just him and one other guy, Pooh Racing, as in Winnie the Pooh. And in fact, their mascot was Winnie the Pooh. And we had these shirts that had Winnie the Pooh that said Pooh Racing, Nanaimo, British Columbia on them. And he used to say things like, you know, there was too many people that took racing too seriously, and it should be fun. And that's why he called his team Pooh Racing. At least that's the way I remember it. We lived all over British Columbia. We moved to Vanderhoof in 1967. Then between 67 and 70, we moved to Peachland in Fort St. James, and my mom took us back to Grants Pass, Oregon, and then back to Vanderhoof, and then I think back to Peachland maybe. Honestly, I'm getting old and I'm starting to forget, but then Kelowna, BC, and then from Kelowna to Nanaimo, British Columbia, and then we went from Nanaimo to Sechelt when my parents split up one of the many times. And then from there we went to Ocean Falls, and we spent 3 years in Ocean Falls, which is about 360 miles north of Vancouver, British Columbia on the coast. There are no roads in, no roads out. He used to say that the town's zip code, which is VOT1PO, stood for very odd town, one pub only. From Ocean Falls, we moved to Hazelton, British Columbia, way up north, and then from there to Port Alberni, British Columbia, where I graduated high school. But before I graduated, we also moved to Ucluelet, British Columbia, and back. During all that time, my dad loved to party, loved to drive fast. I grew up either around racing or, well, he just raced on the road anyway. We used to commute from Ucluelet to Port Alberni, and that drive by any sane person is about an hour and a half, and my dad would do it consistently in under 45 minutes. And one day we were at a computer store of his, and a RCMP officer came in. Now, that particular day, we happened to be driving my mom's Honda Civic because my dad's Fiat X19 was in the shop or something. And the RCMP officer found out that we commuted every day from Ucluelet to Port Alberni, and he said, "Gosh, have you ever seen a guy in a little red sports car, you know, driving on that road?" And my dad asked him why, and he said, "Well, that guy every morning when I'm having my coffee down at the bottom of Sutton's Pass, that car comes through at about 110 miles an hour, and I almost spill my coffee." My dad looked at him and he said, "Well, you should probably just not drink coffee there." What a straight face. And then I think he went and made sure that he wasn't driving the Fiat that day. That was just my dad, right? 110 miles an hour all day long, every day was, if that's what the car would do, that's what he was going to do. If it could do 140, well, he'd do 140. He didn't care. That's what he did. I will say, though, in those days, there was a heck of a lot less traffic on the roads and a lot less people. And my dad had been racing for a number of years and was a pretty good driver. He and his partner generally were number one and number two, or number two and number one, depending on the year, on Vancouver Island in the various autocrosses and sprints and hill climbs and things. They were very good. Now, to give you an idea about my dad and his driving, in 1975, we left Nanaimo, British Columbia to go to the Knox Mountain Hill Climb in Kelowna, BC. And they didn't have a lot of money. And so he decided to tow his race car with our Fiat 124 sedan, four-door sedan, 1800 twin cam, fairly new car. And on the way to Kelowna, I think we were going over the Hope Princeton Highway, which is a pretty windy, into the mountains, highway in British Columbia. And some guy in an MG decided to pass us going up one of the hills. And so my dad dropped the hammer and started racing this guy while pulling his race car and the whole family in the Fiat, plus all of our luggage and everything else. And we're literally racing another car, drifting around corners while... As a young man, I loved it. I'll be honest, I did. And I always wanted to race. It was the thing that I really wanted to do. I also wanted to go back and finish the homestead in Vanderhoof. And one year when I was... probably 15 years old, we got a letter that if my parents paid the back taxes on the property, they could continue to hold the 160 acres that they had. It was an agricultural lease instead of a homestead. And basically an agricultural lease is when a homestead fails, they can get a 99-year agricultural lease, and as long as they clear the right amount of property, then they can hold it. So we got this letter that if they paid $1,500, and this would have been around 1981, that if they paid that back taxes, they'd keep the property. So I tried to convince them to pay it so that my buddy Doug and I could go up there in the summer and start clearing land and build a cabin and all that kind of stuff, because that is something I always wanted to do. I'd started camping when I was very young. In fact, just before I turned 12, I had convinced my dad that I should be allowed to go camping by myself. And my mom didn't want me to do that. She was afraid. We lived in Ocean Falls. There were bears and wolves and cougars and all kinds of things running around. And it's kind of an area that you might not want an 11-year-old camping by themselves in the mountains. But my dad convinced my mom that since the natives did that, that's how they proved their manhood, right? The young 11, 12, 13-year-old boy would go out into the woods and survive a night or two by himself. And if he did, he was a man. So that's what my dad told my mom anyway. Whether it was true or not, I don't know, but it convinced her to let me go do it. And I had been wanting to camp for, over a year, probably 2 years at that point. I loved the idea of going out in the woods and camping and building structures and forts. And I was always building forts and lean-tos and all that kind of stuff. So by the time I was 15, or the summer I would turn 16, the idea of going back to Vanderhoof and building a cabin and homesteading that piece of land, I just loved that idea. But that obviously wasn't going to pan out because, frankly, my parents couldn't afford that. $1,500 was a lot of money in those days. For $1,500, you could buy a pretty decent car, actually. Not a new one, but you could certainly buy a good used car. In fact, I bought a good used car for $300 and $1,000 of repairs on brakes and things like that. And guess what? That car was great running car until I crashed it, but that's another story. When I got my driver's license, my learner's permit, the way my dad taught me to drive. Now, but let me back up a minute. The first car I drove, I was 14, and I rebuilt that Fiat twin cam that we had after it got blown up on a long trip we were doing. Mom didn't check the oil or something else happened, or Dad warped the heads, who knows. It got blown up, and so I ended up rebuilding that car when I was 14, and that's a whole nother story. But suffice to say, I rebuilt the car, got it running, and my mom made the mistake of giving me a set of keys to the car so that ostensibly when it needed to be washed or something, I could move it to where it could be washed. Well, that just meant that I would play hooky from school. Mom, I'm sick today. And it always was on days that she was commuting with someone else. I'm surprised she never figured it out, but once she was gone, everybody was gone, I'd have breakfast, go out, fire up the car, and I would drive it around the block, several times. And other than the one time when I backed it into a fence and knocked it down and hurriedly put the fence back up and tried to hide that I was doing it, but eventually did get caught. That's a whole other story. But bottom line is I'd already started driving. So by the time I had my learner's permit, which I think at the time you had to be 16 years old to get, my dad decided the way to teach me was he could go to his friends in town, have a few or several drinks, And then on the way home, I could drive. Well, I didn't have a problem with that. I'd go hang out with my buds, and then when it was time to go back to where my dad was, I'd walk back there. We'd get in the car, I'd drive home. But the way we drove home was what taught me how to drive. Because as soon as we were on the edge of town, he would say, all right, punch it, go. This corner's called a French curve. It's going to tighten up, so you need to hold the apex longer than you think you do, or you're going to, not go through the corner right. And you don't spill my drink while you're going around the corner at 100 miles an hour. That proves you're smooth. He never had a drink, but he used to tell me that his racing instructor would tell them that you should be able to put a glass of water on the dash and it won't spill. Well, that's total nonsense, because if you know anything about physics, that's not how it works. That glass is going to slide off the side, and everybody who's been driving more than a day or two knows that. But nonetheless, that was what my dad would say, and everywhere I drove from that point on was flat effing out. Until I started getting tickets when I was in the Marine Corps. Then I learned to slow down, at least on public roads anyway. Now, my dad had joined the Marine Corps, sorta. I did say he was a Marine, but when he was in his, I think he was in college at the time, or his senior year in high school, I can't quite remember. There was a program where you could go, kind of like ROTC, now this is back in the 50s, but you could go to OCS during the summer, and then go finish your first or second year of college or whatever it was, and then return the second summer and finish OCS and get your commission, or at least your reserve commission. And during that period, my dad, who had a bad back, of course, was having trouble with his back. So they basically gave him an option. He could go in the reserves and see how things went with his back, or they could just kick him out. So he went into the reserves, and he ended up working in a air wing unit out of California that used to do a bunch of airdrops, and was the company runner for a while until they medically discharged him. So I don't know much more about that story, other than I think he did 2 or 3 years in the Marine Corps Reserve after OCS. And but he always was kind of fond of that time, and I think because of that and the fact that his brother was also a Marine, or is still, because he's still alive today, but I had decided at one point that I would join the Marine Corps. And you can now kind of see that, Jarhead, how did I get there? Well, there was definitely some influence from my dad. Now, I will tell you that my father was one of those uber-driven people. At one point in the early 90s, he started seeing a group on the internet called alt revisionism, and they had these news groups, and it would be alt this, alt that. You've probably heard of alt right. Well, that's nonsense, but that's the old news group world, where you would have alt history or alt computers or whatever, and it was just alt dot whatever, and that was a Usenet news group designation. And he found one called alt revisionism, and that's apparently where all the neo-Nazis and skinheads hung out. Well, my dad didn't much like what they had to say. Now, our roots are Irish, English, Scottish, and German. I don't know about his. I guess he would be Irish and English. He's Anglo-Saxon and maybe Norse, I guess Norman, because Manly's actually his birth name, and we've traced that back to a Norman name. And there's actually a Manly, England, and there's also Manlys from Ireland. And our family has done some DNA testing, and we know they're all the same. They all came from Norway or Scandinavia anyway, somewhere there. But in any case, so he wasn't Jewish. He was just kind of that person that if he felt that you were doing something really wrong, well, then he wasn't going to stand for it, and he was going to fight it out. And so I guess he started doing a lot of flame wars with these skinhead Nazis. And a friend of his one day said, "Ken, look, you're smarter than that. You're just playing into what they want, right? Don't mess." We didn't call them trolls in those days, but that's what you'd call them today. Don't mess with trolls. That's what they live for. Don't argue with them. Hit them with facts. So in the course of about a year, he read somewhere between 350 and 360 books. And yeah, he could read a book a day easily. And he began using quotes from those books to argue with, fight these guys. But that led him to decide to scan all of those books and more onto an internet server so that he could use that data to argue with these skinhead Nazis. And he, at one point, he actually scanned and transcribed with some help, I actually helped with some of it, the entire Nuremberg trials. Now that site exists still to this day. It's called nizcord.org. I will link it down below. And through that, he actually got the Order of British Columbia, which is the highest civilian award you can get in British Columbia. He worked with a Canadian member of Parliament on the Canadian hate crimes. I guess they call it a hate crimes tribunal. And he also worked with the UN hate crimes tribunal. And he traveled around the world giving speeches on hate crime. But one of the things he would always say is, don't hinder free speech. Don't stop free speech. Don't ban speech. Yes, they're hateful people, and yes, they're essentially doing what you want to call hate speech, but don't ban that, because free speech is really important. And he felt that that was very, very important. What he said was, you don't ban free speech, you fight them. You fight them with facts. You prove them to be liars, to be wrong, to be all those things. And that is exactly what he did. And he did that so well that that site is still there today. It's now owned by B'nai B'rith, whom he gave it to. Though I do know that they supported him for a while as well. And but I'm going to tell you this. My dad, I say he was a troubled man. Well, my dad, he pissed them off. So here's a guy who's fighting neo-Nazi skinheads every day. He did it for hours every day because he couldn't stand what they were doing. And he gave the largest Holocaust library in the world online, at least at the time, he gave that to B'nai B'rith. And then got into some debate with them, some argument, and threatened to drive a Harley with like a hooker or something on the back of it while smoking a joint and park in front of their building in the middle of where they were in Alberta. I mean, all you can do is shake your head. So brilliant and insane, maybe, right? I could go on for hours and hours and hours and tell you about my dad, and honestly, I wouldn't have enough time, because in his 84 years, he did so many things and was so impactful, not just in our lives, but in the lives of so many others, that to sit here and try to recapture all of that, it would be impossible. And I want to say something else, though. I've mentioned many times that he was my biggest fan. But you know, when I was a kid, he wasn't, I wouldn't say a big fan. I never really understood it, but if I went to a ball game, I played softball, for example, he wouldn't go to watch me. He would say, I'm not going to go watch you, sit on the bench. Even when I was a star hitter on a team, he wasn't going to go watch. And then when he'd go to the final awards ceremony, he'd just get in an argument with somebody else. He just wasn't a very happy man. And we really did not get along for a long time. We did during the war, because he was really, really supportive during the war, and that was amazing. But then there were times when we just didn't get along. Not until about 2001, when we began really talking in earnest again. And through my YouTube venture, I guess, he really, truly became my biggest fan. In fact, he watched every single one of my videos twice. At least twice. He would actually pull up my video on his computer or on his television or both and pull it up on his cell phone, because he figured he had a different IP on his cell phone and he had a different IP server for his computer, and then he had, his TV, well, it should be the same thing, so it wouldn't matter, but he tried. And he would watch every single one of my videos and he would share them on the internet. And I know that he posted a lot of them on Truth Social when he joined there. I think he was probably posting them elsewhere. He quit Facebook many years ago because Facebook is what it is, right? But he always watched my videos and occasionally would comment directly on the video, but usually he would just talk to me about them. And he encouraged me to keep doing this. And one of the things he always told me was, he would say, son, listen to your audience. They want you to sit there and tell them how to do something that you know that you can share with them. Tell them that. Because I was always kind of thinking, I want to do like a day in the life at the cabin video. And he would say, well, those are fine. I mean, that's fine. You can do those videos. But if you could just sit down and explain to them something that they want to learn, I think you'll find that that's going to be a really good avenue for you because you're good at that. And he supported me 100% all the way. He had his old Jarhead shirt. Actually, I think he had a couple. He had an old Jarhead mug. And I'd given him one or two of those, but I know he bought one or two himself. And he would tell everybody about my channel. And he absolutely would support my channel every single day. But he also supported everything else I did. He told me one day, which was something that I had never heard from him before, but he said, son, I got to tell you, I'm really proud of you. Everything you've done with your cabin, with your home, with your work, with everything you're doing, I'm really proud of you. And that's an amazing thing to hear from your father. So all I could say now is, love my dad, gonna miss him terribly. He's an amazing man. And if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here today. And not just in the physical sense, but frankly, we lived an adventurous life because of my dad, and he's going to be missed. So, thanks for listening. I do appreciate it. Thanks for all the well wishes. It's going to be a different world now. And not for the better. But we'll keep going. Thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. The old Jarhead out.